Um, Imagine paying a surgeon, a, well, a massive sum of money, to intentionally break and stretch your arm, putting you through sheer agony just so your reach is, I don't know, 3 inches longer.
Yeah, that sounds completely insane.
Right, it sounds totally insane. But what if those 3 inches were the required distance to reach a drowning person?
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are tearing down the comfortable, sanitized version of what it means to help another human being.
Because usually when we talk about charity or assistance, there is this assumption of safe distance, like throwing a life ring from a sturdy, dry pier.
Yeah, you stay warm on the wood, the person in the water grabs the ring, you pull them in, and everyone goes home unharmed. It is a clean, low-risk transaction.
But the moment you step into the world of spiritual rescue, that sturdy pier just vanishes. You are no longer standing on dry wood. You are, plunging into the freezing water yourself. The entire landscape of assistance becomes a hazardous, high-stakes operation. So true. We prefer a version of rescue that costs us nothing but a little physical effort, or perhaps a fraction of our spare time. We like the idea of being a lifeline, provided the rope is long enough to keep us out of the storm.
And the text we are examining today completely annihilates that preference. We are looking at a system where personal suffering is not an accident to be avoided, but a credential to be acquired.
Yeah, so we are taking a deep dive into a 19th century text by the preacher Charles Spurgeon. Specifically, we are looking at his writings on the stark, undeniable cost of winning souls. Our goal for this deep dive is to move past abstract theology and get into the visceral, lived reality of spiritual rescue.
Right. We are analyzing a framework that argues intense personal affliction is the absolute prerequisite for being utilized by God to pull someone else out of despair.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at the actual job description of rescue. Because Spurgeon starts by drawing a very sharp contrast between a comfortable life and a specific calling.
Yeah, he points out that an ordinary person might sleep soundly through the night in their bed, but a surgeon will be called up at all hours.
Well, precisely. He compares a farmer who can rest easily by his fireside to a shepherd who must face brutal, freezing weather for the sake of the lambs.
The contrast he builds relies entirely on obligation versus exposure. Think about the ordinary person and the farmer. They represent lives where the primary goal is personal maintenance.
Right.
When the sun goes down, the day is finished. The doors are locked, the fire is lit, and they are insulated from the harshness of the outside world. Their environment is completely controlled.
But the surgeon and the shepherd represent a totally different category of existence. Their lives are dictated by the emergencies of others.
Yeah, the weather does not matter to the shepherd because the lamb is lost in the snow.
And the hour of the night does not matter to the surgeon because the patient is bleeding. Their comfort is permanently subordinated to someone else's crisis.
Right.
I want to make this tangible for you, the listener. Think about the difference between buying a ticket for a luxury cruise ship versus enlisting in the Coast Guard.
Oh, that is a great way to frame it.
Yeah, so if you are a passenger on a cruise ship and the emergency alarm goes off at 3 in the morning, that is a disaster. It is an interruption to your vacation. It's a violation of the comfort you paid a premium for.
You have every right to be upset because the agreement was smooth sailing.
Right, but if you're in the Coast Guard, that 3 in the morning alarm is the very reason you exist. You cannot be surprised by the storm, and you cannot be angry at the alarm because you signed up to pull people from the freezing water.
The storm is your workplace.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is how this dismantles the modern expectation of a frictionless religious life. We often carry this unspoken assumption that if we are living correctly, our lives will resemble that luxury cruise ship.
We definitely do. We expect the waters to part for us, and we view any severe hardship as a mistake, a punishment, or a failure of the system.
But Spurgeon is asserting the precise opposite. If you have any desire to be useful in pulling others out of spiritual despair, you have to expect the alarm bells. You have to expect the harsh weather.
The discomfort is not a flaw in the system. The discomfort is the system itself.
Yeah, and this requires us to look at the theological weight Spurgeon brings into the discussion, specifically his reliance on the doctrine of divine sovereignty.
Wait, let's ground that for a second. For someone who isn't steeped in 19th century theology, what does divine sovereignty mean in the context of personal trauma or a 3 a.m. emergency?
It means that God is the architect of the circumstances, not a passive observer watching the storm hit. Spurgeon quotes the Apostle Paul, who said he bears all things for the elect's sakes.
So the suffering has a target.
Right. The argument is that God intentionally ordains specific experiences for the rescuer that seem entirely unnecessary or even overly harsh for that individual's own personal life. The hardship is purposely given to them, not to punish them, but because it is the necessary preparation for someone else's salvation. God sovereignly orchestrates the shepherd's exposure to the cold so that the shepherd knows how to warm the freezing lamb.
But that Coast Guard analogy assumes physical danger. How does this translate when the storm is entirely inside someone's mind? That brings up a terrifying period Spurgeon went through before a trip to a place called Mentone.
Yeah, we are shifting from the general expectation of hardship to the absolute crucible of severe depression.
And the historical context of this event makes it staggering.
Absolutely. In the 19th century, melancholy and depression were frequently viewed as spiritual failings. To admit to severe mental anguish was a massive risk for a public figure.
Yet, Spurgeon details that he suffered an intense, fearful depression of spirit. He was physically unwell, but he specifically notes that his spirit was entirely overwhelmed.
He describes his heart sinking within him. He was forced to cry out from the absolute depths of psychological isolation.
And under that immense, crushing pressure, he was scheduled to preach. He didn't cancel. He stepped into the pulpit and chose a text from Psalm 22, which is arguably one of the most agonizing sentences ever recorded.
My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
Yeah. He preached on the sheer horror of a soul experiencing the absolute absence of God.
He notes in the text that he was uniquely qualified to preach that specific sermon at that specific moment because he was actively feeling the full measure of that horror. He was not theorizing about spiritual desertion from the safety of an academic tower.
He was going through it in real time.
He even admits later that he trembled at the bare idea of ever passing through that eclipse of soul again. It was the darkest mental space he had ever inhabited.
So after he preached that sermon, still carrying the suffocating weight of that depression, he walks into the vestry. A vestry is just a small side room in the church where the minister prepares or meets with people privately, and there is a man waiting for him. Spurgeon describes this man as being as nearly insane as someone could be while still remaining out of an asylum. His eyes seemed ready to start from his head.
This man was entirely consumed by a despair so thick you could choke on it. The encounter in that small room is the entire thesis of this text made flesh.
It really is.
The man told Spurgeon that he would have given up entirely, meaning he would have taken his own life or completely surrendered to madness if he had not heard that specific discourse that morning.
The sermon proved to this man that there was one person alive on the earth who actually understood his feeling and could accurately describe his terrifying internal experience.
Spurgeon talked with him, tried to offer comfort, and thought he was a hopeful case, but the man seemingly pushed the comfort away.
Right. He didn't have an immediate magical breakthrough in that little room.
Yeah.
After that interaction, Spurgeon went on his trip to Mentone to physically and mentally recover, and the man retreated into the country.
They did not see each other or speak for 5 years. A massive gap of time. 5 years of total silence, with Spurgeon having no idea if the man survived his despair.
But then Spurgeon is preaching again. This time, his text is, "The Almighty hath vexed my soul." And who walks in after the service? The exact same man from 5 years prior.
The physical description of the reunion is striking. Spurgeon notes that the man looked as different as noonday from midnight, or as life from death.
When Spurgeon asked him if he had finally been brought into peace, the man replied that he had walked in the sunlight from that very first day they met in the vestry.
Everything had changed for him. The shared despair in that room had broken the man's isolation. Hearing his own unutterable terror articulated by someone else was the lifeline that pulled him from the water.
Now, I have to push back on this framework a bit. We're looking at a situation where Spurgeon suffered terrifying, agonizing mental anguish, which then perfectly matched the mental anguish of a stranger.
I see where you're going.
Yeah, isn't there a danger in this line of thinking? If we tell people their severe trauma or their clinical depression is a training module, doesn't that risk invalidating their current pain?
That is a very valid concern.
Because, isn't it a form of toxic positivity dressed up as theology? Telling someone bleeding out that it is actually a good thing because they can teach a first aid class later.
That is the most critical objection to this framework. If this is misapplied, it becomes incredibly damaging. We have to look closely at Spurgeon's assertion that preparation is strictly customized.
Customized how?
He explicitly states that it will not be the same for everyone. Not every person will suffer the same way, nor will any two people have identical preparation, the hardship will match the allotted work.
Oh, I see.
If your allotted work involves counseling someone through the loss of a child, your preparation might involve catastrophic loss. If your work involves reaching the highly cynical, your preparation might involve a terrifying period of intellectual doubt. The principle here relies on a concept called substitutionary suffering, with a lowercase is.
I need you to break down what substitutionary suffering with the lowercase s actually means for a person sitting in their car listening to this.
Sure. In Reformed theology, substitutionary suffering with a capital S refers exclusively to Christ. Christ suffered on the cross as a substitute to provide the atonement for sin. That is a finished, unrepeatable work.
Right.
But believers, with the lowercase s, suffer to provide the delivery mechanism for the grace that flows from that atonement. You bear a highly specific type of pain so that you possess the precise, localized vocabulary needed to speak to someone else sitting in that identical pain.
Your suffering becomes the physical bridge over which comfort travels to another person.
Precisely. It does not invalidate the pain. It gives the pain an intense, unshakable utility.
But I want to challenge that again. What if the person going through the trauma doesn't want the utility? What if they just want the pain to stop? Saying, this will help someone else later, feels hollow when you are the one suffocating.
It does feel hollow in the moment, which is why Spurgeon does not present this as a platitude to be slapped onto a crisis while the crisis is happening.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When Spurgeon was in the depths of his depression before Mentone, he was not comforting himself by saying, this is great material for a counseling session. He was crying out in agony.
Right.
The utility of the pain is often only visible in the rearview mirror. It is only when the man walks into the vestry that the 5 days of darkness make any logical sense. The framework does not demand that you enjoy the suffering. It demands that you recognize the sovereignty of the architect who is allowing it.
Think about your own life for a second. We have all had those eras, those brutal years that we just want to erase from our memory completely. We view them as wasted time.
But if Spurgeon is right, erasing those eras means throwing away the one specific tool you have to pry someone else out of the dark.
If you delete the trauma, you delete the vocabulary required to save the person who is going to walk into your life 5 years from now. That is a heavy, difficult pill to swallow.
It changes the entire architecture of how we view our history. The darkest moments cease to be random, chaotic events and become highly specialized curriculum.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Spurgeon moves from the abstract theology into the actual physics of how the salvation process functions.
Yeah, he uses mechanical analogies to explain the mechanics of this rescue operation. And his first analogy is the one we started the show with, and it is startling.
It is intensely visceral. He asks the reader to suppose that, by undergoing a painful operation, you could have your right arm made a little longer.
He admits that no rational human being would voluntarily care to undergo such an operation just for the sake of having a longer arm. You do not volunteer for bone-breaking surgery for aesthetic purposes.
But he adds a massive condition. What if you foresaw that by undergoing this agonizing pain, you would be enabled to reach and save drowning men who would otherwise sink before your eyes?
He argues that under those specific conditions, the calculus changes entirely. You would willingly bear the agony. You would even pay a heavy fee to the surgeon to be thus qualified for the rescue of your fellow human beings.
You would buy the pain simply to gain the reach. This sets up the fundamental physical laws of this type of work.
Absolutely.
He follows it up with two more mechanical realities that deal with proximity. He says you cannot work a fire escape without feeling the scorch of the conflagration, and you cannot man a lifeboat without being covered by the crashing waves.
Now, we have to think about what a fire escape was in the 19th century. It was not a safe, automated staircase.
Right. It was a perilous manual operation that required the rescuer to be right up against the burning brick, breathing the smoke, feeling the heat blister their skin.
You have to get burned to pull people from the fire. You have to risk hypothermia to pull people from the freezing sea. There is no remote control rescue in this framework. There is no drone strike of grace.
It requires absolute physical and emotional proximity to the danger.
And Spurgeon grounds this in historical biblical examples to prove it is a consistent pattern, not an anomaly.
He brings up Joseph from the book of Genesis. If Joseph is going to preserve his brothers and the entire surrounding region alive during a massive famine, He cannot do it from the comfort of his father's tent.
He must go down into the pit. He must be sold into slavery. He must bear the isolation and injustice of an Egyptian prison.
We need to look at the how of that preparation. How does a prison cell prepare a ruler?
Well, Joseph started as a favored, somewhat arrogant son. If he had been handed the grain reserves of Egypt with that unchecked ego, he might have hoarded the grain or used it to exact petty revenge.
The complete removal of his agency in prison, the years of forgotten isolation, stripped away the ego.
The prison mechanics filed down his arrogance, creating a leader who possessed the necessary humility to distribute the food equitably when the famine hit. The descent into the pit was the required physics to elevate him to the throne.
And he brings up Moses. Moses is tasked with leading millions of people through a deadly, confusing wilderness. How does God prepare him?
By forcing him to spend 40 years in that exact same wilderness, managing a flock of sheep.
Again, look at the mechanics. Moses was raised in the royal courts of Egypt. He knew palace politics, not survival. He tried to rescue his people early on using his own strength and violence, and it failed completely.
God forces him into the desert for 4 decades. He had to learn the terrain, the locations of the water sources, the harshness of the elements, and the massive isolation of the desert long before he ever led a human being through it. The desert rewired his impatience into stamina.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that the cost of rescue is total immersion in the danger. This is not an arbitrary rule. It perfectly mirrors the incarnation.
Christ stepping into human history, taking on human flesh, feeling hunger, experiencing betrayal, and drinking the bitter cup of suffering is the supreme blueprint for this principle. You cannot save someone from the flood while refusing to get your feet wet.
The one who rescues must plunge into the reality of the one who is perishing.
Right.
When you think about basic human biology, this concept is utterly foreign to our self-preservation instinct. Everything within our nervous system is wired to pull our hand away from a hot stove.
We are programmed at a cellular level to run away from a burning building, not toward it.
The willingness to suffer agonizing pain-like, voluntarily letting a surgeon stretch your arm on a table for the benefit of a total stranger, is entirely unnatural. It requires a complete rewiring of our base desires.
We have to override the instinct that screams, protect yourself, with a new, terrifying directive that says, expend yourself.
And that expenditure brings us to the next phase of this process. Getting close to the fire is only half the equation.
Yeah, you can run into the burning building, but if you do not know the layout, or if you do not know how to carry the person out safely, your presence is useless. The rescuer must be precisely shaped to fit the person they are trying to save. This is the principle of adaptation.
Spurgeon details a story about a Mr. Levinson, a man of Jewish descent, who owed his conversion to a city missionary. But not just any generic city missionary. The crucial detail is that the missionary was also Jewish.
Spurgeon points out that if the missionary had not been from the exact same cultural and religious background, he would not have known the heart of the young stranger. He would not have understood the specific familial pressures, the theological objections, or the social cost involved.
He would not have been able to win his ear for the message.
The shared background provided the necessary sympathy and the specific cultural vocabulary. Spurgeon summarizes this with a brilliant mechanical phrase. A key opens a door because it fits the wards of the lock.
Let's linger on that key analogy because I think it is the most vital image in the text. Think about how a skeleton key actually works. A skeleton key is designed to open a wide variety of simple locks. It accomplishes this by being mostly blank.
Right. The metal is filed down to avoid the intricate internal pins or the wards of the lock. It doesn't engage the intricacies, it bypasses it.
In our desire to help people, we all naturally want to be skeleton keys. We want to be broadly applicable, capable of offering a little bit of help to everyone we meet while safely maintaining our own original comfortable shape.
We want to read one generic book on counseling and be able to fix every intricate problem in our neighborhood.
We offer generic platitudes like, time heals all wounds. That's a skeleton key phrase. It bypasses the intricate wards of a grieving person's heart without actually engaging their specific pain.
But a skeleton key cannot open a complex, stubborn, or rusted lock. God uses the intense pressure of personal affliction to cut out the grooves in our lives. He files down the metal.
He shapes us into custom keys designed for specific, highly intricate locks. You do not get to be a skeleton key. You get ground down by your circumstances to fit one particular door.
Which means giving up the illusion that you can be everyone's savior. You are shaped for the lock you were meant to open.
This raises a critical question regarding human pride. because being filed down is an incredibly offensive process to the ego. Spurgeon points out the sheer friction in this text.
He says that you who have delicacy and refinement may have to be shocked into the ability to benefit the coarse and ignorant.
You who are wise and highly educated may have to be made fools of in order to reach those who will not respond to elegant academic methods.
The ego death required here is massive. It means abandoning your preferred, polished method of communication.
If you pride yourself on being dainty, quiet, and reserved, and you are trying to reach someone who lives in a chaotic, loud environment, you might be forced to drop your daintiness for raw, loud energy. The person you're trying to reach is deaf to whispers.
On the other hand, if you pride yourself on being forceful, authoritative, and direct, and you are sent to someone who has been abused by authority, you might have to completely drop that forceful posture for gentle, patient tact.
Your personal preference for how you operate in the world is no longer the priority. The needs of the listener dictate the method of the speaker. You must become the tool that the situation requires, even if you absolutely hate the shape of the tool.
Which leads us directly into the final phase of this preparation, the actual lived experience of humiliation. We are moving from the high-minded theory of being shaped to the very embarrassing real-time process of being cut down to size.
Spurgeon unpacks this by telling the story of an elegant speaker. This is a man who wishes to speak earnestly, but he feels he must be elaborate. He has written out a nicely prepared address.
His notes are carefully arranged. He has a pristine, scholarly document ready to impress the crowd with his intellect.
He's relied entirely on his own preparation, but he leaves the document at home.
Oh, that is a nightmare scenario.
Right? He steps up to speak, and the crutch is gone. He starts okay, gets through his first point from memory, and then looks up for his second point, and there was nothing there.
Spurgeon says the good man flounders about. He struggles to swim. He is mentally panicking, standing in front of a crowd thinking, this is my last attempt. I am humiliated. I am never doing this again.
But it is not his last attempt. He goes home, licks his wounds, and he speaks again. He gathers confidence without his notes.
He grows into an impressive, genuinely effective speaker who connects with the audience rather than just reading a paper at them. Spurgeon says that by such humiliations as these, the Lord prepares him to do his work efficiently.
The humiliation was not an accident. It was the required curriculum to break his reliance on his own intellect.
Spurgeon uses the analogy of a black lead pencil. A pencil is of absolutely no use at all until it is cut.
The fine cedar wood on the outside looks beautiful. It is smooth to the touch. But the wood cannot leave a mark on the paper.
The wood must be brutally cut away by a knife, so the inward metal, the graphite, can have fair play and actually write something.
The elegant speaker was all cedar wood. The public failure was the knife slicing the wood away.
And he shares another story of a man trying to visit individuals door to door to speak to them about their spiritual condition.
The man walks to a house, thinking about all the brilliant, persuasive things he's going to say. But as he reaches the door, he is overcome with a trembling agitation. He feels like he's going to sink through the stone steps.
He lifts his hand to the brass knocker, and his courage completely evaporates. His hand drops.
He actually retreats. The text notes he walks partly down the steps out of sheer, paralyzing fear.
But a moment's reflection sends him back up. He knocks. The door opens. He enters.
The sentences he utters are broken. His prayer is stumbling and awkward, but he notes that the ice was broken. He did the work, despite the overwhelming, humiliating cowardice.
So what does this all mean? How do we synthesize a floundering public speaker, a terrified visitor backing away from a door, and a pencil being sliced open?
Spurgeon synthesizes it by calling this the sharp but salutary knife of affliction. Salutary meaning health-giving or beneficial. Faith must teach the worker to actually value the cutting away of the wood, even when the knife hurts terribly.
The fear, the cowardice, the public embarrassment, these are not disqualifiers for the work. We tend to think that if we are afraid or if we fail publicly, it proves we are not called to the task.
We think imposter syndrome is a sign to quit. Spurgeon argues that these specific experiences are the required apprenticeship.
The fear itself has a mechanical utility. Spurgeon identifies that the fear drives the heart to desperate prayer. If the elegant speaker had his notes, he would have relied on his notes.
Because he forgot them, he had to rely on God. The preparation is the forced realization of your own utter inadequacy.
Without the humiliation, the worker relies entirely on the cedar wood. They rely on their own presentation, their own charm, their own eloquence. The knife of embarrassment removes the illusion of self-sufficiency.
Let's bring this back to your daily life. We spend so much of our energy terrified of looking foolish. We avoid reaching out to a grieving friend because we are afraid we will say the wrong thing, or we will stumble over our words, or we will be rejected.
We view our awkwardness as a permanent barrier to being useful.
This text argues the precise opposite. The very humiliation you are avoiding is the exact training ground required to do the job effectively.
The broken, stumbling sentences of a terrified person who genuinely cares are infinitely more effective than the polished, slick eloquence of someone who feels no sympathy.
The brokenness is the requirement.
The brokenness is what cracks the cedar wood, allowing the empathy to flow out and actually leave a mark.
As we bring the overarching themes of this deep dive together, we were looking at a striking, undeniable cost. Being utilized for the rescue of others is not a weekend hobby. It is a consuming vocation that demands a heavy physical, emotional, and psychological toll.
We see a divine sovereignty that orchestrates our darkest, most agonizing moments, not as random cruelty, but as calculated, highly specific preparation for the benefit of someone else.
The surgeon pays the fee and submits to the breaking of the bone for the longer arm. The shepherd leaves the fire and steps into the freezing rain. The pencil submits to the blade.
The cost is total, but the result is the actual, tangible restoration of the despairing.
We want to leave you with a final concept to mull over. We started this deep dive talking about the freezing water, the lack of a sturdy pier, and the false expectation of clean, safe charity. Now, look at your own history. Think about the heavy, burdensome things you're carrying right now. The seasons of anxiety, the public failures, the grief that feels completely senseless.
If our greatest pains, our deep depressions, and our most humiliating public failures are actually just the cedar wood being brutally stripped away so our lives can write something meaningful for someone else, how does that entirely reframe the way you view your current, seemingly pointless hardships?
Might your present sorrow simply be the precisely customized key being cut for someone else's future rescue?
We hope this analysis provides a new lens for the trials you face.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep thinking critically, keep examining the text, and we will catch you next time.